Hi there, I'm Saremy from Sew, and today I am partaking in the Sew Upcycle 22 challenge hosted by Sew Little Time and Notes from the Sewing Room. I'll link both of them in the description of the video. This is mostly an Instagram challenge, but I've been wanting to make this particular pattern and I thought I would incorporate a couple of little things just for fun. Let's just get to the pattern drafting and sewing, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I am going to repurpose this skirt I used to own and wear a lot, but the waist had a yoke with an embroidered kind of embellished thing, and it slowly kind of deteriorated over time, and I kept fixing it, and I finally just had to cut off the yoke, and now I'm going to repurpose this fabric, which is kind of interesting. And I'm going to be making the sport shorts by Friday Pattern Company, which are right here. This is a free pattern that came out recently. It's kind of a pay-as-you-want scale. And I think what I'm going to do, just to, of course, make it a little bit different, is that I'm going to include the waistband piece on the pattern pieces. That way, when I put in the elastic, turn over the waistband, I can have it anchored to the shorts. And so this is going to make it a little bit quicker to sew, and it's going to make the elastic really nice and secure so that it doesn't twist inside the casing. The one drawback to this is that I'm not going to get that contrast waistband look. It's going to be the main fabric, so it's kind of the little thing you have to give up. The other fun thing I'm going to try is this binding attachment that I have for my industrial machine. It's not a permanent attachment, so it's not quite as good as my old one, but it is still kind of a fun attachment. It's going to make these hopefully lickety-split to sew. So I just want to show you some of the pattern things I did, and we'll sew them up. All right, so you can see that I have the three main pattern pieces for the shorts. I have the front, the pocket, and the back, and that's pretty much all I need for making these changes here. And so the rest of the pieces are some binding pattern pieces right here. And I'm reusing some binding left over from another project for this. And then a drawstring, which I haven't figured out yet. And then here is the waistband pieces. They're in two pieces. And so we're going to measure this right here and see what it is right now. Okay, so it's 4 inches. I selected a 2-inch elastic for this project. So we need a 2-inch casing built onto this short, and so we're just going to go 4 inches up, straight up, and that should be all we need to really do. Okay, so I'm going to keep this really simple. There's definitely more detailed things we can do, and the only thing I'm really concerned with is that when this folds back on itself, it's not going to increase or decrease the overall circumference. But at the end of the day, this is an elastic casing. It should be really straightforward, and the elastic's going to be really forgiving. So the reason I went straight up rather than keeping this angle going, you could keep this angle going, but then you would have to widen your pocket. And I just think that that just adds this extra layer to this. You're going to be able to see this little binding edge right here because this is your opening. You're going to be able to see that on the casing. This is not unlike doing it how the free range slacks by Sew House 7 is. So while this is a little unconventional, it's still something totally acceptable, and it's going to be a really nice finish. All right, so if we want to double check our pieces, what we would want to do is line up our front onto our pocket here, and we would line up the side seam here, and we would line up this waist edge here, and then we can compare our side seams with our back. So the other really forgiving thing about this pattern is the fact that the side seams will overlap like this. They kind of stack on top of each other like this when you sew them together. So that is also a little bit forgiving. So if your side seam doesn't match perfectly, it's not going to be really that obvious. I mean, I'm obviously an advocate for your seams matching, but at the end of the day, if you're just trying to whip out something, you're kind of having fun with this, this is going to be a really forgiving project because it's got a curved hem right here. and you overlap it like this. And so our inseam doesn't change, our rises sew to each other, like the back sews to itself and the front sews to itself, so we're good there. And that's really all we needed to worry about. So let's cut this out and get sewing. So like I said, I already have a bunch of binding, and I'm just going to add a little bit, like 1 length extra to the binding piece, because you cut 4, I'm going to cut 5. And then I should have enough, because I'm going to piece all of it together and use it as one continuous strip. This was left over from some other project and it was pre-washed. Highly recommend pre-washing your binding on this project. It's a really easy step to skip, but if you take one tip away from this today, if you're making these shorts, even if you're not making the way I'm making them, pre-wash your binding, trust me. Otherwise, it's going to shrink up your finish and it will be noticeable and you can't really iron it out. All right, so I'm gonna try and avoid the side seams. There are side seams on this skirt. You can see this actually was a skirt and it had this twill tape hem here. But it had this really fantastic border print, and in person it's really kind of a cool print. On camera it probably looks a little busy, and the yellow and blue is paint added on afterward. All right, so I do want to keep this on grain, and obviously I don't have enough to do my back, but that's okay. I'm going to piece a fabric, I'm going to piece the waist there with a couple of pieces of fabric, and it'll be fine. I'll just press up, open the seam, and still treat it all as one. All right, let's do it. All right, so I need to piece this little waistband piece here, and I need to add double the seam allowance of this width because I need seam allowance to attach it to this piece and seam allowance on the piece to attach it with. So we're cutting it really close. Cotton Drawcord, I have my bias binding, my pattern pieces, my elastic. Let's sew them. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we need to add our buttonholes for the drawcord, right? So we're just gonna lay the waistband piece that has the buttonhole marking here. We're gonna line it up, the cut edge to the cut edge of our garment on the center front line here. So there's a 3/8 inch seam allowance. This fold needs to go there. And I'm just lining up the cut edge of the pattern piece, which is the dashed line, to the cut edge on my fabric here. And then I'm going to mark this buttonhole on either side of the center front. And I'm just going to keep it the same length as the one on the pattern. All right, and now I'm going to just put a little bit of interfacing behind, back here, right over that spot. Just going to use the marking on the pattern for the length. I'm going to put my ends just past the length. All right, repeat for the other side. I'm realizing this fabric is a little bit crazy, and I apologize about that, but I am trying to reuse something. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to piece in that piece of fabric on my backs that my backs were just too tall for the skirt that I was cutting out. So I just need to fill that in. So, all right, so we have our fronts, our backs, and our pockets, and now I'm going to bind them all. So this is kind of the fun part. And if you want to see me install the binding attachment, just go to the end of the video. I'm going to put it there. All right, so we're ready with the binding attachment, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bind around each of my pockets here, the curved edge. Now you can't really see what's happening underneath, so you need to check in once in a while and make sure that your binding is getting folded under there and stitched. And with homemade binding, you have a little bit more, error sometimes. But for the most part, it does a really good job. All right, so that's one pocket there. We'll see. That looks really good. I'm pretty impressed with this little attachment, to be honest. This is only the second time that I'm using it for a project, and I really like the results. My old binding attachment stretched the binding a little bit, and that was a little bit problematic. It had its benefits, but mostly it wasn't great. All right, so we're gonna cut the... I try not to actually sew too much without something in there because I don't want to waste any of my binding. All right, so we have our short pieces, and now we're going to do the pocket opening here, which is this shape here on the front. So we're looking at the left front right here. And I'm going to butt the other one up against it so that I don't waste any binding, just like this. This fabric is really thin, and these binding attachments do really, really good on one layer of fabric or one layer of vinyl or something like that. When I had that little interior corner there, so that's why I was pushing it a little bit to make sure I caught it. If you have a spot that your binding attachment doesn't catch, it's better just to finish your whole seam. Unless the binding is completely messed up in there, then you might need to stop and kind of fix it. But if you just have like a little hiccup, just keep going and go back and fix it later. All right, so I'm gonna trim up my binding here so it's flush with the edges. All right, so we're gonna line up this pocket here. Go to your notch. Get this nice and flat, and we're gonna top stitch it on. And I'm going to go straight across the top here at the waist because we need to secure this anyway, just like that. And we're going to do it at the side seam here as well. And then that way we've enclosed the pocket at the top in here, and now we have our whole pocket there ready to go. All right, let's do the other one. My binding is a little bit it's like drawn in a little bit, so we're gonna just pull it a little tiny bit, flatten it out. All right, I'm gonna go up the side seam here to catch it right there. And then we're gonna go across the top, catch it here. All right, so I have the fronts with the pockets stitched on there. You can see the other side there, just like that. And now we're going to sew our center front seams on the front and the back, and I'm going to use the overlock for that. And then we're going to bind our last step. It'll be really fast. All right, so I have the fronts right sides together. And now I'm going to do the back with the back right sides together. All right, so we have our center front and our center back here, and now we're going to do our inseam. So this little short guy here, we're going to put those together just like this. I'm going to press the seams opposite of each other, just kind of nest them into that seam right there. All right, so our shorts have really taken shape here. Look at this, they really look like shorts now. So our next step is to bind the side seam, and we're gonna start at the waist on the front or the back, go all the way around the hem and then back up. All right, so I'm ready with my attachment. This is gonna be a nice long stretch. Poking my threads in there. And I like to pull like this when I have these pivot points with the curve. So I'm approaching a seam in my binding, but this little attachment actually does better than my old one, so that's great. All right, and this is the front, so I'm gonna press the inseam to the back. Well, I am already playing binding chicken right now, and I thought I measured all my binding, but you know what I'm thinking? I wasn't supposed to bind the pockets, so my bad. I think you can just overlock those and top stitch those and save yourself a lot of binding, which is kind of a bummer because I'm really cutting it close with binding because I'm using scraps for all this. So, all right, so I went and made myself some more. All right, so my last binding here. I'm going to start at the back. Thankfully, I think this little differently colored piece of binding is only going to be on my back because this fabric was really interesting. It had a border print on it. I have a lot of seams in this binding. All right, and so this time I'm going to press the seam away from me, the inseam, toward the back. Ooh, cutting it close right there, I can tell. Let's see. Okay, I think I'm gonna have enough binding. Phew. All right, I made it. Okay, we're good. All right, so our next step is we're going to make the side seam here, and we're gonna overlap it to the notch at the bottom here. I'm gonna do the front on top of the back. You can do whatever you want. And we're just gonna overlap the binding here, and I'm gonna sew to where that circle marking is at the sides on the side seam. So I'm gonna edge stitch this. And then I'll have the mark here. And then go across and up. All right, do the other side. All right. Now time for the fun part. I mean, the binding was the fun part, right? Make all these flush. And now we're going to overlock our elastic onto the waistband. And that's why I wanted to include the waistband in with the top of the pattern so that it can just sew right down into the body there. All right, so let's make sure this is secure here. And we'll get this flush, just like that. All right, so I have my elastic length and I'm gonna secure it in a circle. This is kind of important. You wanna just overlap it however much you allowed for your seam allowance. And then I'm gonna stitch over it quite a few times to make sure it's really nice and secure. And I'm only overlapping mine about 5/8 of an inch. All right, and now we're gonna overlock it to the waist, but first I'm gonna mark a few spots on it so that I know where the quarters are. Okay, and now let's mark the short. Okay, I'm gonna line up my centers just like this. And I'm gonna find the halfway point, which isn't usually the side seam, and it's not here, so I'm gonna mark that. You can even use a notch as well, but I think just marking it's good enough because you don't want too many notches, this edge right here. All right, so now we're gonna overlock, and all you need is your elastic and your short. If you wanna use clips, you can do that too. All right, so I'm gonna put my elastic in here. I'm gonna line up the seam that I made at the center back. Just like this. And I'm gonna get it going right now. Just kind of get it sewing. Because then I can use my machine as kind of a helping hand, all right? I'm gonna push the seam allowance this way. I'm not sewing on there quite yet. I don't wanna trim the elastic. If you wanna drop your knife, you can do that. All right, so I'm gonna stop, needle down. And now I'm gonna look for my first point that goes to the side seam here, right here, just like that. And I'm gonna stretch this, but I'm not going to sew. I'm gonna stretch it, and now I'm gonna sew, and we're gonna hold it stretched. We don't wanna stretch while we sew, we wanna hold it static. If you need to pause, that's okay. I'm gonna rearrange a little bit, and see there's my mark. I'm gonna go to that mark again, like this. Hold it, and I always hold it behind the work as well, just so I can make it really secure. All right, now same thing, here's my next mark. Here's my center front, and I'm gonna line those up at the seam. hold it back here, stretch, and hold it this way. And make sure my pocket isn't folding up on itself. There we go. And it's really important you don't move the stretch while you're sewing, otherwise you might break your needles. So there's my mark right there. Let's get it to the center. All right, and now our next side seam is right here. And I just go to each landmark like this. Let's move that elastic closer to the edge. I am trimming a little bit of fabric. All right, last stretch. No pun intended. Try not to trim your already stitched edge here. And there we go. All right, so I switched my thread color, and on my elastic waist here I have this little serger tail, and I have my label. So I'm just going to tack my label right over that serger tail to kind of secure it. And I'm just going to tack my label on here just so it's easier to handle on the next step, so I don't have to worry about it and use a pin. There we go, and then let's just trim the rest of this thread tail there. And so now we're ready to stitch down our waist, and we're going to do kind of the same thing we just did on the serger, where we're going to kind of do it in sections, and we're going to hold it while we sew. We're not going to stretch it while we sew. All right, so we're going to start to center back, and I kind of stitch close to this edge here, not right at the edge, but pretty close. All right, so let's get going. So I'm going to go to as far as I can hold it, you know, maybe not all the way to the side seam, but about right here. And you kind of want to fold this, you know, perpendicular to the seam, right? You don't want to like slide this along, right? So kind of get this lined up onto itself. And a side seam is a really great place to make sure you're doing that, right? All right, and so now I'm going to stretch it, and I always hold it behind, and then sew. And make sure your fabric is pulled down nice and tight. It'll look a lot nicer. All right. Don't worry about bunching, just stretch, straighten it out, pull your fabric nice and tight so there's nothing loose on the top. Stretch and then sew. And then pause again and rearrange. And I'm getting to my buttonholes here, so those should land right in the middle of the waistband, and they are. All right, so again, I'm pulling this down, stretching, and I always stop needle down. That's really important. It's like a helping hand. Trying to get this lined up a little bit better. I don't expect the side seam to land perfectly on top of itself, but I think this pattern would, because it does look pretty straight up and down there. I have a little tuck right there in my fabric when I serged it on, and that's fine with me. All right, let's see how we did here. Cut your threads. Should be all done except for the drawcord. That looks pretty cute. Here's my big roomy pockets. That's what it looks like on the inside. And then last thing we have is the drawcord, which I have right here. And I'll use a safety pin to thread it through. All right, so our last sewing step is going to be to sew our casing in for the drawcord if you're using it. So I'm going to start this at the buttonholes here. Mine are a little crooked from one another. I always do that. So I'm gonna give myself a nice big casing. All right, and same thing, you're gonna stretch it, and let's put the shorts inside out too. It's easier since I don't have a free arm. I'm gonna stretch it, then sew, stretch and sew. And this is gonna secure my pockets too that are going through the waist. So just try and maintain a nice even thing. I'm looking a nice even width for your casing, and I'm looking at my throat plate and where that's lining up. All right, we'll repeat for the other one. All right, so now I just need to add my Drawcord. All right, home stretch. This was a little bit of a task to get this through. For the home stretch there, I could use my loop turner to pull, which is kind of nice. There we go. Tie a knot. Very cute. Let's try them on. Well, I really appreciate you watching me today. Thanks for tagging along, and I love my new shorts out of my old skirt, which is really fun. Let me know what you think, and I hope that you enjoyed this Sew Up Cycle 22 challenge. Have a good one. All right, so this little piece of tape is just to hold my screw to the binding attachment so I don't lose it because it goes with it. And this isn't an installed binding attachment like it is on machines where it's permanently installed. I've had one of those. It's amazing. I don't really need one of those anymore, so I bought this one. It's really affordable. I'll link it in the description. And it's really hits the, you know, it hits the sweet spot in being able to bind things pretty easily and fun. There is some quirks to it, you know, but I actually think it does a little better job than my old one does going through seams on the binding, so that's good. So right now what I'm going to try and do is line up this fold edge right here to where the needle is. And I find with my presser foot, let me bring the camera down here. Okay, so I brought the camera down here. So I'm trying to line this fold up with the needle here. And with my presser foot, because it's split in the front, what happens is this little edge of fabric is going to get caught along this edge of the zipper, or the presser foot. And then the little fold will go like this, like up through the slot right here, right? So I'm trying to find that balance where this fold gets sort of caught by this toe of the presser foot, but that the needle isn't too far into the binding. So it's definitely a balance. And maybe if you have a closed-toed presser foot, you won't have this issue. So it just screws into this little circle right here. I forgot I was going to show you this. So the little circle that looks like a face right there, there's 2 screw holes, and you can put the screw in one of those. And this long slot here makes it adjustable. And so that's what I was working on here. I use the rest at the back of the machine, this right here. This spool right here, that's for your machine to rest on when you tilt it back. I use that to hold my binding, so that's what's back there right there. All right, and so the binding comes from the back there just because I like it to be out of the way, and I put the wrong side of the binding facing me, and then I'm just gonna floss this thing here. I'm just gonna go up and down like this, and then that way now it's ready to go. You can even do it including this one right here, like that. There we go. I just included this little slot here. All right, so now I like to put it at an angle, just like this. And then you use this little slot to kind of guide your binding. Now you want the binding kind of going in there straight. And then I'm going to pull it through. And I'm going to pull it into this little folding mechanism like this. And I'm going to put some tension back here so they can kind of get it caught in there. This is really the trickiest part. The one that's permanently attached isn't so tricky. All right, so I've got it in there. So now I just need to get it folding correctly. And so you might need to pull a lot through, and then you can just pull it back to get your binding back in there, like this. And now I can see that there's fold on upper and lower edges here. And the fold is kind of in the middle, or the center of the binding is in the middle there. I know it's really hard to see at this angle, but that's what we're going for. So, all right. I'm just going to pull it back out a little bit to reclaim some of my binding and just make sure that it all stays in there folded correctly. All right, and you can always test it out. You can just start sewing. You don't need fabric in there. And just check it out and see how it's doing. All right, so I'm going to pull it over a little bit more. I feel like I don't have to be that close to the edge, which is great. There we go. And there we have it. All right, so now we're ready to bind. So when I pieced all my binding together, and I highly recommend just piecing it all together, you're gonna save so much binding if you do that. Just take the time. And then I trim my seam allowances really close and I press them really good with an iron. So